Okay, everyone, something huge is happening in Canada right now. And honestly, it's happening incredibly fast. We're talking about this massive, sudden shift in population growth. And trust me, it has some really big implications for, well, pretty much everything, from our economy all the way down to the housing market. So let's get right into it and break down what's really going on.
So get this. Just a couple of years ago, Canada was basically in the middle of a population explosion. The country was growing at a staggering 3%. I mean, think about that. That was a major, major boom. A huge wave of people helping to shape the nation. Well, that boom, it's over. And, it's not just a little slowdown. We're talking about a complete dead halt. The latest projections are showing that growth is set to fall to pretty much zero this year. I mean, just let that sink in. Going from 3% to basically nothing in such a short time, that's not tapping the brakes, that's slamming them on in a speeding car.
So, the big question is, right, what on earth is behind this incredible reversal? I mean, how did Canada go from a full-on sprint to a dead stop so quickly? Well, it's not just one single thing. It's more like a perfect storm of some really powerful forces all hitting at the exact same time.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we're going to break it down into 5 key shifts. First, we'll look at the global picture. Then, a massive change in our own natural population. After that, we'll talk about the end of a housing supercycle. Then, we'll see how this whole thing looks different depending on where you are in the country. And finally, the big one, what this all means for the economy's new speed limit. All right, first step. It is absolutely crucial to understand that this isn't just a Canadian story. Not at all. We're actually part of a much bigger worldwide trend that's affecting pretty much every developed nation out there. You could think of it as a global headwind that we're all sailing right into. Now, this chart really puts things into perspective. Yeah, Canada's drop is super sharp, but just look around us. The US, they saw growth of just 0.5% last year. And if you look across all the G10 advanced economies, growth is already chugging along at less than 1%. So yeah, our old average of 1.1% was pretty strong, but the new reality is this global slowdown that we just can't ignore. And here's the big takeaway from all that. It's actually pretty simple. When you have fewer people joining the workforce, there's really only one way for your economy to grow, and for all of us to have a better standard of living. And that's for each worker to become more productive. This puts a ton of pressure on innovation and efficiency, not just for us here in Canada, but for the entire developed world. Okay, so you've got that big global trend pushing down on us. But at the exact same time, it's colliding with a huge shift that's happening right here at home. This goes beyond just immigration numbers. We are literally on the verge of a historic demographic turning point for Canada.
So check out this timeline, because this is where things get really wild. Back in the 2010s, you had this huge millennial generation right in their prime childbearing years, and that kept birth rates pretty healthy. But now, well, as they get a little older and fertility rates keep dropping, we're getting closer and closer to a major tipping point. By 2028, and this is a big one, it's projected that for the first time ever recorded in Canada, more people will die than will be born.
The consequence of that is just undeniable. I mean, with a natural decline in population just around the corner, immigration isn't just one piece of the growth puzzle anymore. It basically becomes the essential engine we need to keep the economy from stagnating. So getting our immigration policy right, it's more critical than it has ever been. Okay, point number 3. Let's talk about something that affects millions of us directly: housing. For the last decade, we've had this massive demographic wave, right? All the millennials entering their prime home buying years. And that fueled a truly historic housing boom. Well, that wave, it's just about to crash on the shore. This comparison really shows you the whiplash. In the decade before 2020, that key group of people aged 25 to 39, your classic first-time homebuyers, was growing by almost 1.5% every single year. That's a lot of demand. But now, the projections show that growth in that exact same group is actually going to turn negative through 2028. That demographic tailwind that was pushing housing up, it's flipping around and becoming a headwind. And you know what? This isn't totally new territory. We've actually seen this movie before. Think back to the long housing slump of the 1990s. What was happening then? Well, the massive baby boomer generation was aging out of their prime home buying years. It just goes to show you, demographics are like this slow-moving but incredibly powerful force. And right now, that force is starting to point in a totally different direction. Okay, number 4. And this part is super important.
This whole national story we're talking about, it's going to feel completely different depending on where you actually live in Canada. The Great Deceleration isn't going to be spread out evenly at all. It's creating some really different situations from coast to coast.
This table really breaks down that growing divide. So you've got Ontario and BC, which are probably going to see the sharpest and fastest slowdown. Why? Because so much of their recent growth came from non-permanent residents, and those numbers are being capped. Then there's Quebec, which is kind of facing its own long-term challenge of near-zero growth. But then look over at the prairies. Places like Alberta are completely bucking the trend. They're expected to keep growing strong, mainly because they have younger populations.
And these regional differences, they're going to have some very real-world consequences. You could see housing markets cool off in some provinces while staying hot in others. Provincial governments are going to face totally different problems too. Some will be scrambling to build infrastructure for more people, while others might be dealing with a shrinking tax base and figuring out how to pay for things like healthcare. It's really one big slowdown, but it's creating a bunch of very different local stories.
Okay, last but not least, let's tie this all together and look at the big picture, the entire Canadian economy. What does this whole slowdown mean for our country's ability to create wealth and prosperity down the road?
So to get this, we have to talk about a concept called potential growth. Now, the easiest way to think about it is like an economy's speed limit. It's the fastest it can grow year after year without overheating and causing a bunch of inflation. And that speed limit is basically set by two simple things: having more people working, which is the labor part, and making each of those workers better at what they do, which is the productivity part. And here's the bottom line. Since that first part of the equation, adding more people to the workforce, is slowing down so dramatically, Canada's entire economic speed limit is coming down with it. In fact, the Bank of Canada now thinks our potential growth rate has dropped all the way to about 1%.
This quote really puts our new reality into focus. It basically means that in this new era, something we used to think of as pretty weak growth, like 1.5%, might actually be considered strong compared to our new, lower speed limit. And that completely changes the game for policymakers. It means the economy could start to overheat and cause inflation much more easily than before. And that has a ripple effect on everything from government spending to where interest rates are headed. All right, so let's do a quick recap of what we've learned. Canada's population growth has pretty much slammed on the brakes, going from a 3% boom to almost nothing. This whole thing is mirroring a global slowdown in other developed countries. Two of the biggest drivers are a historic baby bust and the fact that the millennial housing boom is winding down. And remember, this impact is going to be really uneven, creating a big divide between the provinces. And the big takeaway? The entire economy's potential speed limit is slowing down because of it.
And that brings us to the final and maybe the most critical question of all. Look, for decades, Canada has really relied on a growing population to power its prosperity. It's just been a given. But as we head into this completely new era, this great deceleration, the challenge ahead is crystal clear. Can we innovate fast enough? Can we become productive enough to make up for that slowdown? Because honestly, the answer to that question is probably going to define Canada's future for decades to come.